In 1969, in a chronic care hospital in the Bronx, there was a ward full of people who had not moved in decades. Not paralyzed exactly, not in comas. They sat upright in their chairs, silent, their faces set like wax, some of them for 40 years. The staff treated them as furniture, bodies to be fed, turned, washed, and wheeled back into place. Then a young neurologist named Oliver Sacks gave them an experimental drug, and the ward woke up. People who had not spoken since the 1920s began to talk. One woman told him she had spent years composing letters in her head that she could never send. Because here is the part nobody had understood. They had been awake the entire time, conscious, listening, trapped. So what does that to a person? What can lock a fully awake mind inside a body that has simply stopped answering for 40 years? The answer is a disease that swept across the entire planet, infected more than 1 million people, killed roughly half of them, and then vanished so completely that most people have never heard its name. It was called encephalitis lethargica, the sleeping sickness, and a century later, we still do not know what it was. It announced itself quietly in the winter of 1916 in a psychiatric clinic in Vienna. A neurologist named Konstantin von Economo noticed something he could not place: patients who fell asleep while they were eating, sitting up, mid-conversation, mid-task. They were not tired in any ordinary way. They could be roused, would answer a question, and then sink straight back down into sleep, as if the brain switch for staying awake had simply been removed. In April 1917, von Economo stood before the Vienna Society for Psychiatry and Neurology and described a new disease. In France, a physician named Jean-René Cruchet reported strikingly similar cases within days. Then it spread. Over the next decade, it moved through Europe, across to North America, into the Soviet Union, India, Central America, everywhere people went. It arrived alongside the great influenza pandemic of 1918, and for a long time people assumed the two were the same thing. They were not. But the timing would haunt the science for the next 100 years. What made encephalitis lethargica so frightening was that it refused to look like one disease. In its most common form, victims slid into the deep, unending sleep that gave the illness its name, often paired with paralyzed eye muscles and double vision. In another form, the opposite happened. Total insomnia, restlessness, and a sleep cycle flipped clean upside down, so the patient came alive only in the dead of night. Some developed what doctors called oculogeric crises. The eyes would roll involuntarily upward and lock there, fixed toward the ceiling for minutes or hours, while the person stayed completely conscious and completely terrified. And in children, the disease did something stranger still. Some who survived underwent a wholesale change of character. Placid, gentle children turning impulsive, aggressive, unrecognizable to their own families. That detail was a clue, even if no one could read it yet. Whatever this disease attacked, it was reaching the deep machinery that governs how we sleep, how we move, and who we are. And here is where the science gets genuinely revealing, because we now know exactly which machinery it wrecked. The inflammation zeroed in on the basal ganglia and the midbrain, and especially on a small structure called the substantia nigra, a band of dark, pigmented cells that manufactures dopamine. Dopamine is the chemical that lets intention become motion. It is the signal that turns "I want to stand up" into the act of standing. Starve the brain of it, and the bridge between will and movement collapses. When pathologists later examined these brains, they found the dark cells of the substantia nigra dying and leaking their pigment into the surrounding tissue, a visible scar of destruction they called pigmentary incontinence. So the frozen patients were not demented and they were not absent. Their minds were intact. The disease had simply severed the line between the conscious self and the body it was supposed to command. Von Economo himself wrote that to look at these patients, you would assume they were in a state of profound dementia, and that you would be entirely wrong. For many, the acute illness was a death sentence. Roughly a third to half of those who caught it died, sometimes within days, sliding from sleep into coma and never returning. But the survivors faced something that was, in its own way, worse. Months or even years after recovering, many were ambushed by a second illness, post-encephalitic Parkinsonism. Their muscles seized into rigidity. Movement slowed to nothing. They became the living statues of the chronic wards, conscious, aware, and frozen, sometimes for the rest of their lives. These survivors were warehoused in long-stay institutions and quietly forgotten. One of them, decades later, would describe watching his own reflection age in a mirror across the room year after year, unable to turn away. Which brings us back to that Bronx ward in 1969 and to Oliver Sacks. The new drug he tried was L-DOPA, a chemical the body converts directly into the dopamine these brains had been starved of for half a century. And it worked explosively. Patients who had not walked or spoken in decades stood, laughed, danced through the corridors, spoke without stopping as if to make up for every silent year. Sacks would later write about them in a book called Awakenings, which became a film starring Robert De Niro and Robin Williams. But the title hid a darker truth. The Awakenings did not hold. As the weeks passed, the drug's magic curdled. Patients developed violent tics, uncontrollable movements, hallucinations, and crushing psychological crashes. And one by one, they slipped back into stone. The dopamine could revive them, but it could not repair what the disease had burned away half a century earlier. So, what was it? What actually caused encephalitis lethargica? This is the part that should bother you, because the honest answer is that nobody knows. For decades, the obvious suspect was the 1918 influenza virus, since the two epidemics overlapped almost perfectly. But when scientists went back and tested preserved brain tissue from victims, they found no trace of influenza genetic material at all. A newer theory points the finger inward, at the immune system. When researchers examined modern cases that resemble the old disease, the great majority carried antibodies that attacked their own basal ganglia. It may be that some infection, possibly a streptococcal one, the same family behind strep throat, tricked the immune system into mistaking the brain's own cells for the invader and turning its weapons on the self. Other researchers still argue for a hidden virus, perhaps an enterovirus, never definitively caught. The truth is that the evidence is fragmentary, the brain samples are few, and the case remains open. Here is the detail that should keep you up at night. The epidemic vanished as mysteriously as it came. By the late 1920s, the new cases dwindled to a trickle, and by the 1930s, encephalitis lethargica had effectively disappeared. The last known survivor of the original epidemic died in 2002, a disease that infected millions, that froze minds inside still bodies for 40 years, that reshaped how we understand sleep and movement and dopamine itself, and we never learned what it was or why it left, which means the most important question about it is not the one we can answer, it is the one we cannot. If we do not know what caused it, we cannot know that it will not come back. The frozen patients in those wards were not simply ill, they were suspended at the exact border between being a person and being a body. And it turned out that the distance between the two could be measured in a single missing chemical,